Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. Thank you so much for your continued feedback, your additions to the conversation, your participation in this community. I want to give a special shout out today to our 57 patrons over on Patreon. That's fantastic. I appreciate each and every one of you. Every dollar that is donated through Patreon goes directly into the same fund that the GoFundMe is being used for, that was set up by our Discord moderators. All of it goes into the same fund, which is going to be used to pay for my travel to historic sites to create original content for you guys. There is some of that coming in the next few days. Be watching for my original content from the battlefield at Cold Harbor, the battlefield at Yorktown, as well as the cemetery in Richmond, Hollywood Cemetery, where there are a number of famous graves that I had a chance to visit this past week. We're going to dive into something a little unique. A lot of you have been asking me for reactions to Simple History's content. So we're going to take a look at Simple History's Sinking of the Titanic. Now, I grew up with the Titanic being one of my very first historical interests. I was 8 years old when the Titanic was discovered on the ocean floor by Robert Ballard. It was, as a kid, just something that fascinated me. And so I just, as I often do when it comes to history, when I get interested in something, I just dove into it head first and just grabbed all the information I could. These are the days before the internet, so I got books. I watched things on TV when they came on. But I just absorbed all I could about the Titanic. Here in my area where I live, there was a man, I think his name was George Wick. There's a lot of stuff named after him, including Wick Avenue in Youngstown, and he was aboard the Titanic, went down with the ship, so we have kind of that local connection as well. So I'm excited to dive in to see what they talk about on this video. Don't forget to make sure to click on the link in the description, go to the original content creator, give them a like and a subscribe if you would. Let's see what they have to say.
The Sinking of the Titanic, 1912. The luxury British passenger liner RMS Titanic began construction on March 31, 1909 in the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland, and was completed 3 years later in 1912. As one of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners, it was designed to be the largest luxury passenger ship in the world.
Now, a couple of fascinating things right off the bat. Titanic was huge. So was Olympic and Britannic, the two sister ships. But compared to today's modern, if you've ever been on a cruise, today's modern cruise ships just are enormous and just dwarf the Titanic. I mean, figure like out to maybe like right here is how wide they are compared to the Titanic, and probably 2 or 3 times as high. I mean, they're just huge. But at the time, absolutely enormous. This is a very tumultuous time in the history of Ireland as well. Belfast is in Northern Ireland, which is the part of Ireland that today is still part of the United Kingdom, unlike the rest of Ireland, which is a separate republic. So there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of unrest at this time. And of course, this is a time when work conditions aren't necessarily the best, and so there's a lot of that as well. And I forget the name of the show, but there's actually a really good TV show that was on that kind of showed a lot of the background into how it was built.
And would cost $7.5 million to build. It had a length of 882 feet 9 inches, or 269.1 meters, a height of 175 feet, or 53.3 meters, and a width of 92 feet 6 inches, or 28 meters, and it weighed 46,328 tons. Below the waterline was the orlop decks for cargo, and the tank top where the engines, boilers, turbines, and electrical generators were. At the very top was the boat deck.
And these engines are like the size of a 3-story house. They're just absolutely huge, and there were multiple of these big steam engines underneath. These funnels, only 3 of them actually released anything. I think the 4th one was actually fake, but it was done for aesthetic purposes. It looked like a bigger, more powerful ship if you had 4 funnels, and I think that was why they did it.
Where the bridge and wheelhouse were, as well as the lifeboats. In between were the decks for passengers with first, second, and third class cabins. The level of luxury was so high that second class was comparable to first class on any other ship. The 2,240 passengers would be from all walks of life, from millionaires and celebrities to poor immigrants looking for a better life in America. The ship would act like a floating hotel, featuring a grand staircase which allowed first-class passengers to move from deck to deck and had a domed skylight to allow natural light in. The ship also featured a gymnasium, dining saloons, a reading room, a barber shop, a squash court, a Turkish bath, and a swimming pool. The ship carried 20 out of a possible 64 lifeboats. Therefore, there were only enough for half the ship's population.
At this time, there's no law that says you have to have enough lifeboats for everybody on board. That came about because of Titanic. And I think the main reasoning why they chose not to have enough lifeboats, there were a couple of things. Number one, because it had this double hull bottom and it had a lot of safety features like the bulkheads, it was assumed, and it was a fair assumption, that if it did take on serious amounts of water, that it either wouldn't sink at all or that it would sink so slowly that there would be plenty of time to get rescue ships close enough to get all the passengers off. And so they wanted to keep the deck space clear so that people could kind of walk the decks, and they didn't want to clutter the deck with all the lifeboats. So, people criticize that decision in hindsight because of what happened, but there were a lot of really good reasons that they chose not to have the lifeboats, and they were pretty sound for the most part. Nobody expected that it would take on the damage that it did, the way that it did. It was a really kind of a fluke, really unique way that it was damaged that got around the watertight compartments.
However, this was within legal requirements. Lifeboats were only intended for carrying passengers to rescue ships and not keep the entire ship population afloat. As a result, the company who owned the Titanic, White Star Line, felt complacent enough to keep the number of lifeboats low so the deck wasn't cluttered. Many claimed the Titanic was unsinkable because its hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments. It was said that if up to 4 of these flooded, the ship would still stay buoyant. All of these qualities drew the press to frequently talk about the new passenger liner. Disaster. In the morning of April 10, 1912, passengers began boarding the Titanic in Southampton, England, with large crowds gathering to watch the ship depart. At noon, the Titanic set sail under command of Captain Edward Smith, beginning her maiden voyage.
And Edward Smith was actually very close to retirement, and I believe he had been kind of their lead captain for the White Star Line. He was usually the guy that they went to whenever there was a maiden voyage for a new ship to kind of, work out the kinks and make sure everything was working right. So, it was natural for Edward Smith to command this maiden voyage of Titanic. And I think they made a stop in Queenstown in Ireland was their last stop before they went out to sea.
It would stop at Cherbourg, France, and then Queenstown, Ireland, to pick up more passengers, and then begin...
And I swear, because some of you guys say, hey, you watched this before. This happens a lot where I say something and then immediately after it gets mentioned in the video. I swear I have not seen this video before. If I do a reaction to a video I've seen before, I will usually let you know that. I'm not trying to hide anything at all. I noticed that does happen.
And its journey across the North Atlantic Ocean towards New York City. On April 14, 1912, warnings were coming in of icebergs from other liners, so Captain Smith had plotted a new course and continued to steam at full speed, which was standard practice. As it became dark, the temperatures were dropping to below freezing, and there was no moonlight or waves, making it difficult to see approaching icebergs.
And the water was actually below freezing as well. Salt water can drop below 32 degrees Fahrenheit without freezing. And that was what was happening here. I think the water was like 28 degrees Fahrenheit at the time. And yeah, there's some talk that they were trying to break the transatlantic speed record, but I don't think that there was a serious consideration that was going to happen. They weren't kind of plowing ahead needlessly without paying any attention. It was just kind of a fluke circumstance where, like he said, because it was so still, there was no moonlight. The water was so still, therefore you couldn't see the waves crashing against the base of the iceberg. And honestly, if they had just plowed straight into the iceberg, there probably would have been some severe damage up front, and people probably would have died, but the ship would have stayed afloat. The reason it sank is because they tried to dodge it and because it ground along the side. And contrary to popular belief, I'm sure they'll get into this, it didn't carve a big 300 foot long steady hole in the side. It actually kind of poked holes, and it also didn't like carve a hole. The rivets, the way that the rivets were attached, when the steel was attached with the rivets, the system they used actually made the rivets really brittle, and they were breaking, and so it actually just kind of broke the rivets and buckled is what actually happened.
At 11:40 p.m. ship's time, the ship's lookout, Frederick Fleet, spotted an iceberg from the crow's nest. He rang the warning bell and telephoned the officers at the ship's bridge, shouting, "Iceberg right ahead." Fleet had spotted the iceberg with his eyes, as the crow's nest binoculars were locked away. The key's owner, Officer David Blair, had been removed from the Titanic's crew at the last minute and forgot to hand over the key. The officers on the bridge quickly turned the ship away from the iceberg, but it was too late.
So what they actually do is he orders, and I think it was Murdoch, I think was the guy in charge, the first officer. He orders hard to starboard, so they start turning to the left to avoid it, and then he does what they call tried to port around it, which meant that then he swings it back the other way so they can try and bring the back of the ship over this way, so then they start turning to the right. But unfortunately, it compromised too many compartments.
The Titanic grazed the iceberg along its side, ripping several holes in its hull below the waterline, with fragments of ice hitting the deck. At first, everyone felt relief. The lookouts and the passengers didn't even feel the collision.
Some people thought that they had thrown a propeller off the back, like one of them had flown off, and that was why they felt that little bit of a shudder. On a ship that size, you graze along an iceberg like that, you're not going to feel a whole lot.
11:50 p.m. Captain Smith and the ship architect, Thomas Andrews, went to inspect the damage. They knew the ship would start sinking, and by this time, 6 of the watertight compartments at the front of the ship's hull were already breached and began flooding. 12 a.m. The captain sent out a distress call over the radio in the hopes that there were other ships nearby, and gave the order for the Titanic's passengers to board the lifeboats.
The standard distress signal at the time was called CQD. It wasn't SOS, but they did use SOS, which was new. SOS, because you're using Morse code, SOS is an easy one to do because it's ... dash ... I think that's what it is. And so it was real distinguishable and easily noticed. But I think they did CQD as well. There was a ship that was within range that could have gotten there in time to rescue the passengers, and I think it was called the Californian. But I think they had turned off their wireless for the night. It was, in the early stages of when they actually had wireless technology where they could send these signals out to land, but also to other ships. And because Titanic had all these rich passengers on board, they had a big backlog of people sending messages ahead to New York for when they arrived. And they'd actually kind of told the other ships to shut up because they were trying to send things before they hit the iceberg because they're all using the same wireless traffic. And so then basically they either shut it off or ignored it or what. But it was a tragedy because they could see the Californian from the Titanic. It was close enough that they could see the lights, but they never came. And most of the people survived the sinking. It was the cold water that killed everybody. I mean, yeah, there were some people on the ship that went down with the ship, but most of the people died in the water afterward.
He knew there were only enough for half the population of the Titanic. At 12:25, the lifeboats began their loading, with women and children first, as this was the protocol at sea. Many passengers still did not understand what was going on, and confusion and disorganization meant that the first lifeboat to leave had only 28 women and children aboard, when it could carry 65 people. First Officer Murdoch took the order to mean women and children first, then men if they were there, while Second Officer Lightoller took it to mean women and children only. The Carpathia, which was 58 miles away, heard the distress call and began sailing towards the sinking Titanic to rescue the passengers. Distress flares were shot into the sky to help locate the sinking Titanic. By 1 a.m., with the lower decks flooding, the bow of the ship began to sink below the water's surface.
The early stages of the flooding, and there's some really great videos on YouTube where people recreate with animation, like a minute-by-minute real-time showing the flooding, and it's fascinating to watch. early on, it didn't, like, you could understand why a lot of people didn't really take it seriously and didn't think it was sinking, because early on it didn't go down that quickly. Most of the sinking happened fairly quickly right at the end. So it went from looking like it was going down a little bit to very rapidly sinking because of how much water it was taking on, how big the ship was. And so by the time people realized, hey, this thing really is going down, it was too late. Most of the lifeboats had already gone. Like they said, a lot of them weren't even full.
Water was pouring in 15 times faster than it could be pumped out, which was not helped by the fact that many of the passengers had left their portholes open. The unsupported stern and its propellers rose out of the water into the air. Panic and chaos set in as lifeboats were running out. Some people pushed their way to the lifeboats, while others accepted their fate and stayed behind or gave up their spots to more vulnerable passengers.
So Wallace Hartley is the name of the band leader, and they actually found his violin. Or violin case. I don't know if they actually have the violin or not, but remembered as one of the heroes of the Titanic because he and the band stayed on and continued to play even while they knew they were dying. And it was said that one of the last songs they played was Nearer, My God, to Thee. And there's actually two different versions of that song, and the version that you see in the movie Titanic is probably not the one that they played. It's the one in the movie is the one that most people are familiar with today. It goes, nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee. That's probably not the tune that they played because there was a different version of the song. But
many did not want to survive the disaster and be branded a coward back home. By 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat had left, but 1,500 people were left on the ship. The deck was now at a steep height, and many passengers fell into the freezing, icy waters. So
they talked about some people, kind of put on this brave face, others not so much. Benjamin Guggenheim was one guy. Ida and Isidore Strauss decided, because Ida could have gotten on a lifeboat, and she decided they'd lived a whole life together. She wasn't leaving her husband. And you see the scene in the movie where they're laying down on the bed next to each other and just kind of accepting their fate. It's very sad to think about. But that's just the reality of the situation, and it must have been horrifying in those last moments.
At 2:17 a.m., the captain announced, "Every man for himself." The stern gave way under the pressure and broke off, with the front half disappearing to the bottom of the ocean.
Now, they believe today, and it was debated heavily because the eyewitness accounts didn't really fully agree on the fact that it broke up. Some people said it did, other people said it didn't. And until they found the ship in the mid-1980s, nobody knew for sure, and then they confirmed that it had, in fact, broken in half. But they believe today that it never fully separated initially, that it broke, but the double hull bottom kind of stayed attached, and it kind of pulled itself down together. And it was only after the stern went under the water that it finally kind of broke apart, and then one half of the ship kind of flipped around the other way. I think that's kind of how they generally agree it happened now.
At some point, Captain Smith went down with the ship, a maritime tradition that the captain would do in accepting responsibility for all on board.
And I've read some eyewitness accounts who claim that they saw him in the water afterward, and that some people actually tried to get him into the lifeboat, but he refused to be taken out of the water and into the lifeboat. The owner, Bruce Ismay, who was the kind of the main operator, the guy running the White Star Line, it was said, he was rescued. He got into a boat, and some people claim that he dressed as a woman to do it, or that he just kind of snuck onto a boat, and nobody really said anything about it. Thomas Andrew, the architect who designed the ship, went down with the ship, as did the captain. First Officer Murdoch went down with the ship, but some of the other officers did in fact survive.
Some say he went to the wheelhouse and waited for the end, while others say he committed suicide using a pistol.
I think Murdoch is the one that some people claim committed suicide. I've never heard that said of Captain Smith, but maybe there's a source for that.
The stern, smashing into the water's surface, became level and soon started to fill with water, sinking nearly 4 kilometers beneath the surface of the ocean. Many died as a result of drowning, but the main cause of death was hypothermia in the freezing waters, which occurred within minutes.
And surprisingly, and I looked this up recently because I found myself curious about it, it only took 5 or 10 minutes for the ship to sink to the bottom. I mean, it went really fast. It was like 35 or 40 miles an hour is how fast it was going down. So it hit the bottom of the ocean pretty fast and pretty hard. Even though it was 2.5 miles down, it went fairly quickly.
Some of the lifeboats returned, but only 4 survivors were found. At 3:30 a.m., the distress flares from the Titanic were spotted by the Carpathia. The Carpathia arrived to the scene at 4:10 a.m. and picked up the lifeboats. Only 705 passengers would survive the disaster, with over 1,500 people losing their lives.
So, a couple of things in closing. They sent out, I think McKay Bennett was the name of one of the ships they sent out to start finding the bodies. And they did recover hundreds of the dead. And most of them were buried in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which was kind of the nearest big town to where the Titanic sank off the coast of Canada. The Olympic and Britannic, incidentally, I think Britannic sank during World War I. It was a hospital ship. And I think it was sunk off the coast of Greece, I want to say. It was torpedoed or hit a mine or something. But it only lasted a few years after this. But yeah, the whole thing's very sad, but it's a fascinating thing to learn about. Had an opportunity a number of years ago. My wife and I went to Las Vegas. I'm not a gambler. I'm not into that scene, but it was cool to go because at the Luxor Hotel, they had the Titanic exhibit there, and they had a whole big side piece of the ship. And they would give you the name of a passenger that you would learn a little bit about, and then at the end you found out whether or not your passenger lived or died. My passenger died. My wife's passenger survived. Very sad, very fascinating thing to learn about. But I would love to hear your thoughts. Anything you might want to add to this conversation about the Titanic. Let's talk about it. Let's continue that conversation. Please hit like. Make sure you check out Simple History. They've got some really, really good stuff. And it's really short, too. 5-10 minutes, a lot of their videos. Definitely worth checking out. And make sure you hit like here as well. Thanks for watching.